The beginning of American air power. When German General Adolf Galland looked up at the sky over Berlin in 1944 and saw 1,000 American bombers blotting out the sun, he whispered to his aide, "We have lost the war." But the nightmare had begun much earlier, in a way no one in the Reich could have predicted. 2 years before that moment, in the summer of 1942, the first American B-17 flying fortresses touched down on British soil. The Germans intercepted the intelligence reports and laughed. The Americans wanted to bomb Germany in broad daylight. It was suicide. The Luftwaffe had spent 3 years perfecting their defensive tactics against the RAF's night raids. These naive Americans would be torn apart by German fighters and flak batteries within weeks. Even the British were skeptical. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris had watched his bombers get slaughtered in daylight raids early in the war. He had switched to night bombing for a reason. When he met with the young American commander, Brigadier General Ira Eaker, Harris was blunt. "You'll lose half your force in 6 months if you insist on this daylight madness." But the Americans had a plan the Germans hadn't anticipated. Their B-17s and B-24 Liberators were flying fortresses in every sense. Bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns, these aircraft could defend themselves in ways no bomber had before. More importantly, they carried the top-secret Norden bomb sight, a mechanical computer that promised unprecedented accuracy. The American doctrine was simple: fly high, fly in tight formation, and destroy specific targets with precision bombing. The 8th Air Force established its headquarters in High Wycombe, England. Young American crews, many barely 20 years old, began arriving by the thousands. They brought with them an industrial capacity that would prove more terrifying than any weapon. Back in the United States, factories were producing bombers at a rate the Germans thought impossible. Ford's Willow Run plant alone would eventually produce one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The first American raid came on August 17, 1942. 12 B-17s attacked the Rouen-Sotteville rail yards in France. It was a small raid, almost symbolic. The bombers returned safely, and the Americans celebrated. The Germans noted the raid in their reports, but remained unconcerned. 12 bombers? The RAF sometimes sent 300, but then the raids kept coming, and they kept growing. By January 1943, the Americans were sending 50 bombers at a time. By spring, it was 100. The German pilots began noticing something disturbing. When they shot down an American bomber, 3 more appeared to take its place. Where were all these aircraft coming from? The real shock came on August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after that first symbolic raid. The Americans launched 2 massive strikes simultaneously. 146 bombers attacked Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, while another 130 bombed the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had, shooting down 60 American bombers in a single day. German propaganda declared it a great victory. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring told Hitler the Americans had been taught a lesson they wouldn't forget. But in the intelligence offices, analysts were tallying different numbers. The Americans had dropped over 700 tons of bombs in one day. The ball-bearing production at Schweinfurt had been cut by 34%. And most terrifying of all, just 6 weeks later, the Americans came back to Schweinfurt with another massive force. This wasn't how air warfare was supposed to work. An attacking force that took such casualties should need months to recover. But the Americans were replacing their losses in weeks. Young German fighter pilots who had celebrated shooting down 5 American bombers in a single mission returned to base only to face 10 more raids that same week. In the operations rooms beneath Berlin, German military planners began studying the numbers with growing dread. The Americans weren't just bombing Germany. They were waging industrial warfare on a scale never seen in human history. Every destroyed American bomber was being replaced by 3 new ones. Every dead American airman was being replaced by 5 trained replacements. The mathematics of attrition weren't working in Germany's favor. By the end of 1943, the Americans had dropped over 50,000 tons of bombs on German-held territory. It was just the beginning. The factories in America were now operating at full capacity. The training schools were producing 4,000 new bomber crew members every month. And in Britain, massive concrete runways were being laid across the countryside to accommodate the growing American air armada. The Germans still controlled the skies over the Reich, but for the first time, officers were asking a question that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. How long could they maintain control? The Americans had demonstrated something more frightening than any superweapon. They had shown they possessed unlimited industrial capacity and an unlimited willingness to use it. The sky itself was about to become Germany's greatest enemy, and the storm was only beginning to gather strength. The strategic bombing campaign intensifies. The year 1944 began with a question that haunted every German citizen. When would the bombers come today? The Americans had transformed air warfare into a daily terror that ground down not just German industry, but German morale itself. The turning point came with the arrival of a single aircraft type that changed everything, the P-51 Mustang. Before February 1944, American bombers flying deep into Germany were on their own. Their fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only accompany them part way before turning back due to fuel limitations. This left a deadly gap where German fighters could attack with impunity. But the Mustang, fitted with drop tanks, could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The effect was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to picking off unescorted bombers now found themselves in desperate dogfights with American fighters that could match or exceed their performance. Worse still, the American fighters adopted a hunter-killer strategy. Instead of staying glued to the bomber formations, Mustang squadrons would break off and hunt down German fighters wherever they found them, even following them back to their own airfields. In February and March of 1944, the Americans launched what they called Big Week, a series of coordinated strikes against German aircraft production facilities. For 6 days straight, waves of bombers pounded factories at Leipzig, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and a dozen other cities. Nearly 4,000 bomber sorties dropped over 10,000 tons of explosives. The Luftwaffe threw everything into the battle, flying over 3,000 defensive sorties. They shot down 260 American aircraft, but the Germans lost over 400 fighters and, more critically, nearly 300 trained pilots. The mathematics were brutal. The Americans could replace 260 bombers in 2 weeks. The Germans couldn't replace 300 experienced fighter pilots in a year. Every student pilot in training represented fuel that could have powered a tank, aluminum that could have built a fighter, and time that Germany no longer had. By spring 1944, the combined bomber offensive was operating with devastating efficiency. The RAF would strike cities by night, creating massive firestorms that destroyed residential areas and killed civilians. The Americans would arrive by day, targeting the factories, rail yards, and oil refineries with their precision bombing. German defenders had no rest. They fought the RAF by night, slept fitfully while repairing damaged aircraft, then faced the Americans by day. The tonnage numbers told the story of Germany's doom. In 1943, the Americans had dropped 52,000 tons of bombs. In just the first 6 months of 1944, they dropped 130,000 tons. And the rate was accelerating. Some days saw over 2,000 American bombers in the air simultaneously, dropping 4,000 tons in a single day. German civilians developed a dark humor about the raids. They called the Americans terror flyers, and the British night disturbers. But beneath the jokes was genuine terror. In cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen, entire neighborhoods had been transformed into rubble fields. Survivors emerged from bomb shelters to find their homes simply gone, replaced by smoking craters and twisted metal. The industrial impact was equally devastating. The Americans had identified German oil production as a critical vulnerability, and they attacked it with systematic fury. Between May and September 1944, they bombed every major synthetic oil plant and refinery within range. German fuel production collapsed from 316,000 tons in March to just 17,000 tons by September. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves grounded not because they lacked aircraft, but because they lacked fuel to fly them. The transportation system fared no better. The Americans could put 100 bombers over a rail yard and render it useless for weeks. They hit bridges, locomotive factories, switching stations, and repair facilities. By summer 1944, moving anything by rail in Germany had become a desperate gamble. Trains crawled along damaged tracks, often traveling only at night to avoid the fighters that now roamed German skies, hunting for targets of opportunity. Perhaps most demoralizing for Germans was the sheer consistency of the attacks. The Americans flew in any weather that allowed visual bombing. They flew through flak so thick it looked like black clouds. They accepted loss rates that would have grounded any other air force. And behind every loss, 3 more bombers were already crossing the Atlantic to join the fight. German fighter ace Johannes Steinhoff later recalled the hopelessness of mid-1944. We would shoot down 8 or 10 bombers in a single mission and feel victorious. Then we would land, and intelligence would tell us that 40 more bomber groups had just arrived in England. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The preparation for D-Day saw the intensity reach new heights. In May 1944 alone, American bombers flew over 36,000 sorties and dropped over 61,000 tons of bombs, primarily targeting the French transportation system to isolate Normandy from German reinforcements. After the invasion, the focus shifted back to German industry with renewed fury. By the time autumn arrived, the question was no longer if the Americans could destroy German industry, but rather how long it would take. The Germans were fighting with weapons and fuel produced months earlier because their factories were being systematically demolished. The mighty industrial machine that had conquered Europe was being torn apart from the sky, one bomb at a time, and there was nothing the Reich could do to stop it. The human cost and industrial might Lieutenant Robert Morgan climbed into the cockpit of his B-17 for the 25th time, knowing that statistically he shouldn't be alive. The odds of completing a 25-mission tour over Germany stood at just 1 in 4. 3 out of every 4 crews that started the tour ended up shot down, captured, or dead. Yet here he was, about to finish what so many others never would. The factories back home made his survival possible, but they couldn't make it less terrifying. Every mission meant 10 hours of flying through skies filled with exploding flak shells and German fighters trying to kill you. At 30,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to 50 degrees below zero, wounded men could freeze to death before their crewmates could help them. Oxygen systems failed, engines caught fire, wings snapped off under stress. And through it all, you had to maintain formation and fly straight toward your target, while the entire German defense network tried to blow you out of the sky. Back in the United States, an industrial miracle was unfolding that defied comprehension. The Willow Run factory in Michigan stretched over 3 million square feet under a single roof. Workers assembled B-24 Liberators on a production line that moved like a river of aluminum and steel. At peak production, a completed bomber rolled out every 58 minutes. The factory employed 42,000 people working around the clock. Most had never built an aircraft before Pearl Harbor. Many were women who had been housewives 2 years earlier. Boeing's plants in Seattle produced B-17s with similar efficiency. The company that had struggled to build 50 planes a year before the war now delivered over 300 per month. Across America, tens of thousands of workers fabricated the intricate components. Pratt & Whitney engines in Connecticut, Sperry bomb sites in New York, machine guns in Massachusetts. The logistics of coordinating it all represented an achievement as remarkable as the aircraft themselves. Each bomber required over 400,000 individual parts. A single B-17 contained 1,500 pounds of electrical wiring, enough to stretch from New York to Philadelphia. The precision needed for these aircraft exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Yet somehow America was building them faster than Germany could shoot them down. The human price, however, remained staggering. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 bombers went down. That meant 600 men killed, wounded, or captured in one afternoon, the equivalent of an entire infantry battalion wiped out in 4 hours. Those who survived rarely spoke about what they saw. Friends disintegrated by direct flak hits, burning men jumping without parachutes to escape the flames, aircraft spiraling down with dead pilots still strapped in their seats. German cities experienced the inverse nightmare. In Hamburg, a series of raids in July 1943 created a firestorm that killed over 40,000 people in a single night. The fires generated winds strong enough to uproot trees and suck people into the flames. Survivors described streets where the asphalt had melted and caught fire, where entire families had been baked alive in their bomb shelters when the oxygen was consumed by the flames outside. In the bomb shelters beneath Berlin, Cologne, and Munich, civilians developed a fatalistic routine. When the air raid sirens wailed, they grabbed their emergency bags and descended into the earth. They sat in the darkness, counting the explosions, praying their shelter wouldn't take a direct hit. They emerged hours later to discover which neighbors had died, which buildings had vanished, which streets were now impassable rubble fields. The American crews struggled with their own demons. They could see the fires they caused, the cities burning beneath them. Some bombed through thick clouds, never seeing their targets, which made it easier. Others had perfect visibility and watched entire city blocks explode beneath their bomb bays. Tail gunners had the worst view, watching their handiwork recede as they flew away, seeing the smoke columns rise thousands of feet into the air. The psychiatric casualties mounted alongside the physical ones. Combat fatigue, they called it. Men who had flown 20 missions and simply couldn't fly the 21st. Pilots whose hands shook so badly they couldn't hold the control wheel. Bombardiers who froze at the crucial moment, unable to press the release button. Gunners who saw German fighters in every cloud and shadow. The 8th Air Force established rest homes where exhausted crews could recover, but some men never recovered at all. Yet the production lines never stopped. For every crew that broke under the strain, 3 fresh crews arrived from training schools in Texas, Arizona, and Florida. For every bomber shot down over Germany, 4 new ones crossed the Atlantic on ships or flew across via Iceland and Greenland. The American system had industrialized not just aircraft production, but the entire process of waging aerial warfare. German workers in the factories experienced the terror from the receiving end. They watched as precision bombs destroyed the buildings around them while they cowered in reinforced shelters. After each raid, they emerged to find their workplace transformed into smoking ruins. They cleared the rubble, repaired what they could, and tried to maintain production with damaged equipment and dwindling supplies. By late 1944, some factories were operating at 15% of capacity, their workers producing 1 aircraft for every 10 they had built a year earlier. The numbers told a story of inexorable mathematical doom. America produced over 18,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. They built over 12,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses. Germany's entire heavy bomber production for the entire war barely exceeded 6,000 aircraft total. Even when German fighters achieved tactical victories, shooting down dozens of bombers in a single raid, the strategic situation only worsened. The American air armada grew larger every month while the Luftwaffe grew weaker, and everyone involved knew how this equation would eventually resolve itself. The final year, total air supremacy. By January 1945, the question facing German defenders was no longer how to stop the American bombers, but simply how to survive them. The Luftwaffe had been gutted. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Fuel reserves had evaporated. Aircraft sat grounded on airfields, useless without gasoline. Meanwhile, overhead, American formations flew with an arrogance that would have been suicidal a year earlier. The scale of operations had become almost incomprehensible. On a single day in February 1945, the 8th Air Force dispatched over 1,500 heavy bombers protected by 900 fighters. This massive formation stretched for miles across the sky, a metallic river flowing eastward to deliver death and destruction. German radar operators could track them, coming for hours, but tracking accomplished nothing without fuel to launch interceptors or ammunition to fire at them. The final phase of the strategic bombing campaign focused on obliterating what remained of German resistance. The oil campaign had succeeded beyond expectations. Germany's synthetic fuel production, once capable of supporting both the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, had collapsed to almost nothing. Panzer divisions sat immobile for lack of fuel. The vaunted Me-262 jet fighters, which could have challenged American air superiority, remained grounded because each sortie consumed fuel reserves the Reich no longer possessed. Transportation networks received relentless attention. The Americans had perfected their tactics for destroying rail infrastructure. They would crater the main lines, demolish the bridges, destroy the repair facilities, and then return a week later to hit whatever repairs had been completed. German logistics officers calculated that it took the Allies 4 hours to destroy what required 4 weeks to repair. The mathematics of destruction always favored the attackers. Operation Clarion in February 1945 demonstrated total air supremacy in its most brutal form. For 2 days, over 9,000 American aircraft struck transportation targets across Germany simultaneously. They hit small towns and villages that had never been bombed before, destroying local rail stations and road junctions. The message was unmistakable. Nowhere was safe, nothing would be spared, resistance was futile. Cities that had survived relatively intact now received their turn under the bombs. Dresden became controversial, not because it was bombed, but because it was bombed so late and so thoroughly when Germany's defeat was already certain. On the night of February 13th, RAF bombers created a firestorm. The next day, American B-17s arrived to bomb the survivors and prevent firefighting efforts. As many as 25,000 people died in a city that had been a cultural treasure. The Americans also targeted Würzburg, a Baroque masterpiece that held no military significance. They destroyed it anyway in just 20 minutes of bombing. Pforzheim, known for its jewelry industry, was incinerated with such efficiency that 1/3 of its population died in a single raid. These attacks served no tactical purpose. They were demonstrations of absolute power, messages to a defeated nation that its suffering would continue until surrender. Yet even in these final months, the bombers kept coming in ever greater numbers. March 1945 saw the 8th Air Force fly over 37,000 sorties. April added 29,000 more. The tonnage dropped in these 2 months exceeded everything dropped in all of 1943. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of high explosives and incendiaries. Young German soldiers who had grown up under Nazi propaganda about Aryan superiority now watched helplessly as American aircraft ruled the skies unopposed. They saw bridges blown apart, trains obliterated, buildings reduced to powder. They understood viscerally what their leaders refused to admit. The war was lost, had been lost for months, and every additional day of fighting brought only more destruction from above. The final statistics of the oil campaign illustrated the completeness of the aerial victory. In early 1944, Germany had produced 574,000 tons of aviation fuel. By March 1945, production had fallen to 1,000 tons. The Luftwaffe, which once fielded thousands of fighters, could barely maintain 100 operational aircraft. Pilots who did manage to fly often made only 1 or 2 missions before being shot down by the swarms of American fighters that now hunted across German territory at will. American bomber crews in these final months faced less danger than at any point in the campaign. German flak had diminished as shell production collapsed and trained gunners died. Fighter opposition had virtually ceased. Some missions encountered no resistance at all. Crews would fly to their targets, drop their bombs on defenseless cities, and return without firing a shot. The experience felt surreal to veterans who remembered when every mission meant fighting for survival. The bridges across the Rhine became priority targets in March. American bombers methodically destroyed these critical crossings, trapping German armies west of the river and preventing reinforcement. At Remagen, when the Ludendorff Bridge was captured intact, the Luftwaffe attempted a desperate attack. They lost dozens of aircraft in failed attempts to destroy the bridge, achieving nothing while the Americans poured troops across. As April arrived and Allied armies drove deep into Germany from both east and west, the bombers shifted to tactical support missions. They struck SS positions, destroyed Wehrmacht supply depots, and obliterated any remaining infrastructure that might prolong resistance. Some crews flew 3 missions in a single day, so complete was American control of the air. The psychological impact on German morale proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Civilians who had believed Hitler's promises of wonder weapons and final victory now understood they had been fed lies. The endless bomber streams overhead, untouchable and unstoppable, provided daily proof of Germany's utter defeat. When people emerged from their shelters to find their cities resembling moonscapes, cratered and lifeless, hope died with their homes. By early May, when Germany finally surrendered, the bombing campaign had dropped those staggering 2.7 million tons across 2 years of systematic destruction. The final year alone accounted for over 1.5 million tons, as American industrial might reached its terrifying crescendo. German cities lay in ruins, German industry had ceased to exist, and German resistance had been crushed from the sky in the most comprehensive demonstration of air power the world had ever witnessed. The aftermath and legacy. When the smoke finally cleared over Europe in May 1945, investigators began tallying the true scope of what had been unleashed from the sky. The numbers defied comprehension. American bombers alone had flown over 350,000 sorties against targets in Germany and occupied Europe. They had dropped 2.7 million tons of explosives and incendiaries, an amount that would have filled a convoy of trucks stretching from New York to Los Angeles twice over. The human toll stood equally staggering. 26,000 American airmen had died over Europe, roughly the same number of men who died in the entire Marine Corps during the Pacific Campaign. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war. The 8th Air Force suffered a casualty rate of over 40%, higher than any other American military unit in the war. These weren't abstract statistics, but young men, most in their early 20s, who had climbed into bombers knowing their odds of survival were worse than terrible. Walking through German cities in the summer of 1945 felt like touring the surface of an alien planet. Hamburg had lost over 50% of its housing. Cologne's population had fled from 700,000 to 40,000, the survivors living in cellars beneath mountains of rubble. Berlin lay devastated, with estimates suggesting it would take 16 years just to clear the debris. In some neighborhoods, authorities gave up trying to recover bodies from collapsed buildings and simply bulldozed entire blocks into mass graves. The strategic bombing survey teams that followed the advancing armies discovered uncomfortable truths. Yes, German industrial production had been devastated. Yes, the transportation system had been obliterated. Yes, fuel production had collapsed. But detailed analysis revealed that German war production had actually peaked in late 1944, despite years of bombing. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, had performed near miracles of improvisation, dispersing factories, moving production underground, and maintaining output through sheer organizational genius. What the bombers had accomplished wasn't the simple destruction of Germany's ability to produce weapons. Instead, they had created a death spiral of inefficiency. Every bomb forced Germany to divert resources to air defense that could have built tanks. Every destroyed factory required rebuilding that consumed materials needed elsewhere. Every transportation bottleneck meant raw materials sat unused while finished products couldn't reach the front. The bombing didn't stop German production so much as it strangled it slowly through accumulated disruption. Interviews with German officials revealed the psychological dimension of the campaign. Field Marshal Erhard Milch admitted that the constant threat from above had become paralyzing. Workers couldn't concentrate knowing bombers might appear at any moment. Managers couldn't make long-term plans when their factories might vanish tomorrow. The civilian population had been ground down by years of terror from the sky. Their morale shattered more completely than any military defeat could have achieved. The oil campaign emerged as the clearest success. By targeting synthetic fuel plants and refineries with relentless precision, the Americans had achieved what ground armies couldn't. They immobilized the Wehrmacht. German tanks in the Battle of the Bulge ran out of fuel within days. Fighter pilots couldn't train properly because each training flight consumed irreplaceable gasoline. By early 1945, the mighty German military machine had been reduced to infantry defending fixed positions because it lacked fuel to maneuver. Yet debates about the morality and effectiveness of strategic bombing began immediately. Did Dresden need to be destroyed? What military purpose justified incinerating Pforzheim? Critics argued that the Americans had adopted the same terror tactics they condemned in their enemies. Bombing advocates countered that every day the war continued meant more deaths in concentration camps, more civilians murdered by retreating SS units, more soldiers dying on both sides. Shortening the war by even a week justified enormous destruction, they claimed. The technological legacy proved equally profound. The Norden bomb sight, once considered a revolutionary weapon, had failed to deliver the promised precision. Weather, mechanical failures, and human error meant that less than half of bombs dropped actually hit within a quarter mile of their intended targets. This reality drove post-war development of guided munitions, eventually leading to the precision weapons that define modern air power. The doctrine of strategic bombing itself underwent intense scrutiny. Had it been decisive? The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that Germany could have been defeated without strategic bombing, but it would have taken longer and cost more Allied lives on the ground. Britain's similar survey reached slightly different conclusions, emphasizing the campaign's role in diverting German resources from other fronts. Neither survey could agree on exactly how much the bombing had contributed to victory. Veterans of the campaign carried mixed feelings about what they had done. Some, like Curtis LeMay, who would later apply these lessons in Japan and plan nuclear strategy during the Cold War, believed absolutely in air power's decisiveness. Others struggled with nightmares about the fires they had started and the civilians they had killed. Most simply wanted to forget the fear, the friends lost, the moral compromises made at 30,000 feet. Germany's reconstruction eventually buried the rubble, but memories persisted. Survivors passed down stories of firestorms and shelter collapses to children and grandchildren. Cities rebuilt their historic centers, sometimes authentically recreating what had been destroyed, sometimes embracing modern architecture as a break from the past. The psychological scars proved harder to reconstruct. The lesson that military planners took from the campaign was both simple and terrible. Air power could destroy a nation's ability to wage war, given sufficient resources and ruthless application. Every subsequent conflict saw attempts to replicate this success. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Yugoslavia. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it failed. But the template established over Germany between 1943 and 1945 became the foundation for modern aerial warfare. Those 2.7 million tons of bombs had rewritten the rules of war itself. They proved that industrial capacity could be as decisive as battlefield valor. They demonstrated that distance provided no safety from modern weapons. They showed that total war meant exactly that. Total. Every factory, every rail line, every bridge became a legitimate target when nations mobilized their entire economies for conflict. Standing in a rebuilt German city today, watching traffic flow across modern bridges and commerce hum in glass towers, it's difficult to imagine the apocalypse that descended from clear blue skies 8 decades ago. But the generation that lived through it never forgot the sound of air raid sirens, the whistle of falling bombs, or the sight of endless bomber formations turning day into artificial twilight. They had witnessed industrial warfare at its most terrible and most total, and they carried those memories to their graves.